China takes industrial decarbonization seriously, I think, for two reasons. The first is that it takes decarbonization of its economy very seriously, and that's because it sees decarbonization as an economic opportunity rather than a cost. It sees that the industries of the future are more likely to involve low carbon technologies, and that the push for decarbonization gives an impetus and narrative for investment by Chinese companies. And there's a chance to take leadership in the sectors of the future. And also, it's a security opportunity because decarbonizing can reduce China's reliance on other countries for imported inputs, whether that's energy or inputs into industrial processes like steel making. And the other important reason is that China believes that it's going to decarbonize without deindustrializing. So China doesn't want to lose heavy industry sectors. It wants to retain a complete industrial system. That's very clear from what policymakers say. And to put those two things together, if you're going to decarbonize without deindustrializing, then you have to decarbonize the industrial sector.
Where will they start this industrial decarbonization process?
So looking at the goal that was announced for China's carbon emissions reduction by 2035 of 7 to 10% from the peak, which may be this year or it may be in the years to come, that doesn't seem particularly difficult to meet, especially for the industrial sector. And that's because output in heavy industry is shrinking and is likely to continue shrinking as a result of China's shrinking population and the end of its rapid property sector driven growth model. And that means that China has a lot of room over the next 10 years to try and invest in technologies and try and experiment with technologies that would be needed to drive industrial decarbonization later on. So we definitely see the next 10 years as an experimental period, and we see a policy infrastructure being put in place to try and drive experimentation and innovation in low carbon industrial technology.
What can Europe learn from China in this decarbonization process?
I think the first thing for Europe is to try and understand what policies China is implementing to push forward industrial decarbonization. So that's everything from complex standards for measuring emissions to having a life cycle database of carbon emissions for different products, and also to look at the way that state banks are financing pilot projects around the country. So understanding is important for Europe. There's also an imperative, I would say, to engage with what China is doing on industrial decarbonization, because there's a good chance that some of the industrial policy efforts in this area are going to succeed, maybe in the not in the next 5 years, but maybe in the next 10 years. And given that China is increasingly competitive with Europe in third markets, it's going to be important to know what China is doing. And it might also be advantageous for European companies and European governments to try and have dialogue with China about the process of industrial decarbonization so that they can, in some sense, shift and guide and influence what Chinese companies are doing. And I think there is openness to joint ventures, for example, with European companies on technologies to decarbonize industry.
So would you say this is a golden opportunity for Europe?
I think that it's interesting to look at, for example, how Australia is engaging with China's industrial decarbonization. Australia is a major iron ore exporter to China, and they have seen that the intent is there to decarbonize the steel sector using technologies like hydrogen-based steel making. And Australia this year decided to launch a dialogue on green steel production with China. And the idea is that they can get inside the tent on this long-term process and try and understand what China is doing and maybe influence some of the standards that China is implementing. And that could be in their long-term economic interest. So even though Europe is not necessarily an exporter of raw materials, it is an exporter of technologies. And so engagement with China on this process, given the scale of Chinese industry is much larger than anywhere else, there are clearly some opportunities.